Evan, let's jump straight in because I feel if I don't, we might go on a tangent and we might run out of time. So I'm going to just go ahead right now and say record. We haven't, the last time that you joined us on the Business Karaoke Podcast was in September. How have you been? Tell us how you've been.
Good. And I think it's wise to jump right in because there's a lot that we can cover. So let's try and stay on track. So I've been doing good. There's a previous introduction to me in the last video, so I won't go into that. I'm country manager of Dynamic Yield. And now in addition to that, I've joined the board at TEL, the Tokyo English Lifeline Suicide Prevention Service and Mental Health Clinics. As well as taking on a senior advisor position for Fast Track, which is a company that helps basically promising tech startups to enter the Asian market. And I've been taking on some board positions and just went to the Board Director Training Institute just this week to take their boot camp and get certified as a board director in compliance with the new ESG sort of governance rules. Or initiatives rather. So it's been very busy. I would say the pandemic has been nice in some ways because there's more time due to remote work. There's less commuting. So I think I've been using that time well. I've been trying to skill up and grade up and learn as much as possible.
Right.
But it's been interesting.
Well, yeah, because we saw kind of people either go one or two ways. One way was like, people would go and start baking, and then kind of the other, that was at the beginning of the pandemic. And then, obviously after that, people had very different responses. But that being said, what people might not know about you from our first episode as well, actually, you're also a very avid surfer as well. I've been very much enjoying your pictures and your videos of your essentially your lens to paradise. So thank you so much for sharing that. Evan, I wanted to reach out. I wanted to have you back on the podcast because we're talking about digital transformation. Like always, any time that we talk about Japan and business, we talk about digital transformation, but we also talk about, kind of all of the problems. We're aware of that. And we were lucky enough to have you back in September for episode 18, where we dived into some of the cultural reasons why that happened, some real insights from me, for example, that I think someone wouldn't usually come up with if they didn't have your kind of background. The fact that you mentioned sometimes, Japan might, or there's your theory of Japan being kind of afraid of data centers actually has nothing to do necessarily with culture as such, but actually has more to do with the fact that they live under constant threat of natural disasters. So things like that. So super interesting stuff. And I thought, you know what, I need to have Evan back, and rather, and let's look forward. And we kind of put our flag in the ground. We said, let's talk 2025. Where do we want to be? What's our roadmap? So I want to kind of begin with, before we jump into more of the data, I wanted to learn a little bit. Let me rephrase. I'd love you to share why this is so personally important to you.
Okay, that's a great setup. Thank you. And yes, I didn't spend the entire pandemic studying and working. I got out surfing almost every day. In fact, today I'm limping because I had to pull a few sea urchin spines out of my toe.
Oh, ouch! Ouch!
So I think this is really an interesting time. It's mission critical because a lot of the changes that are going on right now. And I touched on how I've joined the board at TEL there to try and assist with Japan's overall mental health. I think that's one of the reasons why this is so important, because the pandemic has been a real challenge for a lot of people. There are mental health issues, but it's also changing work in ways that I think will alleviate some of these moving forward. We're seeing massive societal changes that are going on right now in Japan in general. So, I'd like to start just by recapping where we are right now, because it's been almost a year. At the time, on the last podcast, we were talking about how we're in this state of lockdown, but we expected that it would end pretty soon. And it's going on, and we can expect that it will go on. In fact, it may simply be a seasonal event where we have to learn to deal with this.
Right.
So I think it's important to take a snapshot of where we are right now, and just let's phrase it this way. let's take a look at Japan's digital scorecard right now in terms of being able to deal with things like this pandemic, as well as the overall state of business and digital transformation in Japan. So, a few quick stats to start with. As of current statistics, Japan ranks 27th out of the OECD nations in digital competency. It is 57th in terms of business agility, which is also a reflection of adoption of internet, technologies and in general ICT. It is currently 17th in startups, so that's a bit of an improvement, but it's still not where we'd like it to be.
Right.
It is 22nd in the world in terms of IT professionals. And currently, there's a lack of about 240,000 IT professionals, and that lack is going to keep growing. We expect that it will grow to 600,000 by 2030 at the current rate. So, of course, this is not just engineers. It encompasses people who are familiar both with the overall interfaces when it comes to information technology and AI, as well as actually the ability to build and program the systems. And then if we look at, that's, a snapshot of the private sector. If we look at the public sector, Japan is currently 31 in the OECD in terms of countries with online government procedures. So only 5.4% of citizens are actually using the government's digital applications at public offices. And only 7.5% of the it's like 56,000 government processes, only 7.5% of those have actually been digitized. So it's like less than 12% of all administrative work is currently transacted online. This is an issue because it directly affects the GDP. Right. So right now, there's been, a very, or not right now, but rather there has been put out a very informative report by METI, the Ministry of the Economy, Trade and Industry, in 2018 that identified what they called the 2025 digital cliff. So the fact that Japan actually faces a confluence of different issues, by 2025, there's a risk of kind of falling off this cliff, and then the GDP would lose 12 trillion yen, which is about 109 billion US dollars annually after 2025. And the reason for this is because Japan's productivity hasn't been increasing. During the past 20 years, it's stayed at an average of 2.9% per annum. So basically, your GDP is a calculation of your overall population and the per hour productivity of that population. Well, Japan's population is declining, especially the workforce. There's an aging workforce, and productivity has been stagnant. The per capita GDP has been 40,000 US dollars per person. It hasn't changed since 1995. Whereas in 1995, the US was at $35,000, and now it's gone up to about 65,000, averaged out. So, Japan is the world's third largest GDP, but it's stagnant at that third position, whereas number two, China, and number one, the US are increasing and growing. So obviously, Japan needs to undertake digital transformation in order to both retain its current GDP, to weather the storm of a declining population, and to deal with crises like the pandemic. It's not doing so well in terms of digital transformation so far. Only 16% of digital transformations have been successful so far, according to a recent report by McKinsey. However, according to another report by McKinsey and the American Chamber of Commerce in Japan, Japan could create 735 billion in overall GDP by 2030 if the digital transformation is successful. So there are a lot of incentives to get this right. Even though Japan's digital scorecard right now isn't that great, there's a lot of hope for the future.
Right. So we're looking really at a calculation of, do we want to lose almost $110 billion annually, or do we want to gain almost 750 billion US dollars? And if we think about that, it's obvious, right? If you were to tell anyone this is kind of this is a crystal ball, make your choice. I don't think anyone really in their right mind would actively choose to run their economy into such troubled water as what we're talking about. And this is always kind of a little bit of a we have to take this with a grain of salt, because we've been hearing for 30 years that Japan's been in decline and won't recover, and yet here we are. So I think maybe the truth is perhaps somewhere in the middle. But one of the things that I'd love to hear your thoughts on, in terms of why maybe people are thinking, where is the issue? There's obviously such a need to move to digital transformation. One issue that's often overlooked is the first step of when it comes to digitalization, which is taking the manual or taking the analog data and essentially making it digital. Often you'll hear companies saying, if we think about digitalization, there's those kind of three categories: the people, platform, process. Japan's great at process, working on platform, and not so great at people. But if you really talk to any kind of digital transformation expert, they often say you have to begin with people and then everything else follows. Whereas Japan seems to be taking the route of, maybe we can kind of overstep the people, and maybe if we just have a perfect platform, maybe that'll kind of work. But that's also creating issues right now. So what's your view in terms of, if the numbers are so obvious, if the calculation is so attractive, why do you really where's the issue? Where do you think the bottleneck is?
Well, I think that's a great point. I mean, the issue is that it hasn't been obvious to senior business leaders until now, until we have the accelerator of the pandemic. So I'll circle back to that in just a moment. But to sort of highlight where Japan is right now, until recently, Japan has been undergoing digital transformation for 20 years now. And we can basically tie this back to legislature. The first legislature that was created back in 2001, it went into effect for the creation of the IT best practices initiative. There were different councils and initiatives and so on. And then various legislature has come in over the intervening 20 years, which has moved things forward to a certain degree on the government side. But it's important to understand that Japan, although this is changing, Japan still has what has been commonly referred to as a developmental state. A developmental state is where the government takes responsibility for guiding basically industry and identifying which companies are going to be leaders in certain fields, as well as setting policy. So traditionally, MEDI, again, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, would set 5-year roadmaps. And they would say, okay, Hitachi, for example, you excel in these areas, continue to focus on those. Toshiba, Panasonic, you guys are good at this, and you focus on those, and the others don't compete with them. So it's a very socialist approach to capitalism. It's not necessarily a full free market economy. Although that is changing now, it was the system, because of Japan's education and a lot of its history and culture, leading to the elites, the most highly educated, the most competent people, feeling that the most change that they could make, the best agent for change or the best vehicle for change, would be to work within the bureaucracy, to work for the government, and to lead policy. And so you had often the best graduates, the best thinkers going into the government and doing the necessary research, working both with universities and with the private sector to set these roadmaps, which worked well. In the 60s and 70s, it worked especially well, and it was the leading drive of Japan's economic miracle. However, there has been a shift. It's now very difficult for this type of top-down goal setting and creation of a 5-year plan, because the roadmap has been so condensed. The speed of business has been so condensed as we move from the industrial age into the information age. It's important to get access to wider data sets and in some ways democratize the decision-making process in order to make good business management decisions, which means that the bureaucracy has had to, in some ways, crowdsource their data sets by working closer with business. And we now see a trend where the bureaucracy actually can't get enough people. They can't get enough graduates to staff their offices. partly because the elites are now moving into the private sector. So we have a lot of businesses now setting the initiative and move towards somewhat more of a US style of free market capitalism. But the underlying, the question that you asked there is more related to, the people issue. Until now, senior management has seen digital transformation as a potential competitive advantage. So if we adopt digital processes, we may gain some advantage, we may gain some market share. However, it is not seen as mission critical because it was viewed as a cost. It wasn't viewed as, ultimately it just wasn't viewed as being very attractive. Because it is an investment that requires such a large investment. And we can touch on that a little bit more in just a moment. But a big part of the reason for this is because of the underlying legacy systems that Japan is invested in. For example, I was just having a discussion in one of the English, Tokyo English, something or other, I forgot their name now, the Facebook group anyway, for expats living in Tokyo. People were asking why the ATMs close at night and it's so hard to get money out during holidays and that sort of thing. A lot of people don't know the global financial infrastructure actually runs on COBOL. So that's a programming language that was developed 60 years ago. It's a business language specifically developed for business machines, and it still runs 95% of the financial infrastructure around the world. But those older legacy programming languages combined with insufficient server infrastructure mean that most Japanese banks actually have to do a batch process every evening. They physically cannot process all of the day's transactions without closing during the nighttime period. So it's only the more innovative banks who've come recently in the market with new systems like 7&I Holdings, the 7-Eleven banks. They have newer infrastructure, and so they're able to process those transactions faster in near real time, and so they have 24-hour service. Right. So that's just one sort of example, one anecdotal example of how digital transformation has been a huge investment that most Japanese corporations haven't been willing to make because of the underlying infrastructure that makes it so difficult to move off of these legacy systems. So that's a big part of it. The other part is that the private sector is waiting for the public sector, and the public sector is waiting for the private sector.
Right, exactly. This catch-22.
It's a catch-22, right? So, Japanese, businesses in general are waiting for clear initiatives, clear direction, clear protocols and standards to be created by the government, and they consider it a massive risk to undertake digital transformation. There's uncertainty, and of course, Japan is very high on the uncertainty avoidance index, which was, a very interesting study first done by Geert Hofstede in the late 60s and early 70s. But I think it's still relevant today. Japan is so high on the uncertainty avoidance index that until everything has been completely mapped out correctly, it's very difficult to undertake any process. So
that's right.
Essentially, until the uncertainty has been removed around cybersecurity and systems being hacked and that sort of thing, most businesses are unable to dive into digital transformation 100%.
I couldn't agree more in the sense that it's not necessarily that Japan doesn't move. It's the idea that everything, you kind of have to have all your ducks in a line before anything moves at all. And once it moves, it's like a rocket ship. Recently, I was leading a workshop regarding 5G and the applied uses of 5G. And one of the very senior Japanese executives said, "Aren't we too late for 5G? Why don't we just wait it out? And why don't we invest in 6G?" And I thought that was so interesting because we're not nearly near the maturity of 5G. And this person is saying, hang on a second, it's a little unclear. Why don't we kind of sit 5G out? and let's kind of then go to 6G, because you kind of have that long-term mindset, but at the same time, it's the idea, it's not being afraid of technology, it's making sure that when we launch, when we run, that it works across all of our systems, because as we know, Japanese companies have very complex stakeholder networks. So it's not necessarily if it works for you, but maybe it might not work with your vendors, or, and if it doesn't work with your vendors, what happens with your logistics and your supply chain, all these other issues. And so just to highlight the truth in what you're saying, also with the story.
I actually agree with him, with your executive contact there. I agree from a certain perspective, in that Japanese manufacturers should, and actually are already, investing their efforts in 6G in order to get ahead of the curve a little bit, because for the very reason that the manufacturers are behind in 5G. So it's actually more the Chinese manufacturers and a few American manufacturers, a few European, who are the leaders in 5G. But that's very different from adoption. Mm-hmm. So, from an investment perspective, I would agree that Japanese companies should be investing in the build out of 6G. But from an adoption perspective, of course, we have to undertake the digital transformation to make use of both the infrastructure that comes with 5G and the underlying business opportunities that come with it. So in a way, yeah, I agree, but it's also indicative of the wider problem, is that Japan missed the boat on 5G, which is why it's looking at 6G now. So yeah. And it really does have to catch up. So, again, Japan is definitely a digital laggard. But we're finally seeing this change, and I'd like to talk a little bit about the massive change agent that we're seeing right now, which is the pandemic itself. So, why, after 20 years of attempts at digital transformation, why is it now this pandemic? What is it about the pandemic that's actually creating real change towards digital transformation? Why is it such a big part of the public conversation now? And I'd like to get your thoughts on that first. We touched on this a little bit in our last talk, but why do you think, in a nutshell?
That's, I think this is the first time I've been interviewed on the Business Karaoke Podcast. Great point. And I do think, and I very much agree with you. Why now? I remember, even if you went, for example, to one thing kind of stood out to me that I just kind of thought, I wonder how long this mentality will kind of stay in Japan, which was, I was in the offices in Toronomon, maybe for EY. I think EY is in Toronomon. I think everyone listening will be able to correct me on whether that's their office, but the offices near essentially Tokyo Central Station, beautiful offices. And at the front desk, there is a sign that says, on Fridays, our employees wear casual clothes. Thank you for your understanding and your cooperation. And I thought that's so funny, because nowhere else would you have to kind of broadcast, our employees are wearing casual clothes. Please forgive our staff if you're in the office and you see them in jeans. This was like, even just 18 months ago, this was kind of the level. And now, for example, we have this kind of bizarre mix where, you kind of be on a call, and we had like a few SMEs join some of our design thinking sessions, and they were in their home in a suit. And I thought, that's so Japan, like the fact that you're in your home, but you're in a suit. So why do I think it's now? I think the only reason why it's now that we've kind of moved from this kind of digital transformation as an option is because it's been a complete global shutdown. I think that some of the other pandemics, for example, that we saw in North America, even some of the pandemics that we even saw in like SARS in Asia, wasn't necessarily as present as it was in Japan. So I think the pandemic, the reason why it's changed so quickly, obviously we can go into like the micro reasons, but that's why you're here. But I think in terms of the macro reason, I think it's the first time that Japan hasn't had another option, because they've been such a strong economy domestically when it comes to services and things like that. But in terms of their manufacturing and their products, it's always been an international market. And then we've seen, okay, that your factories in Vietnam now are, running late on production, and then that affects, you know, the production that then goes to the US. And this is kind of where you recognize that Japan, yes, you're special. Yes, you have your idiosyncrasies, but you're very much right in the mix of being a global economy. And I think it's the first time that they haven't been able to kind of pick and mix when and how they'd like to contribute, particularly with the Olympics at the doorstep as well. So I think it's really just been an absolute cocktail of urgency.
Yeah,
that'd be my best guess.
oh, no, I think that's a great, a great overview of the points. You know, when it comes to Japan's traditionally strong manufacturing sector, which in many ways underpins the economy. Anecdotally speaking, one of the things I've done over the past year is co-found a surfboard brand. We build basically handcraft surfboards and sell the surfwear that goes with them. A little side project. And we were delayed for a few months. We couldn't get like the resin.
Yeah,
we couldn't get the fiberglass resin and stuff necessary to build the surfboards. I'm building a house right now, and it's been put on hold because of the lumber shock. We can't get the necessary wood for it, so we're waiting for that to clear. So there's global supply lines have been disrupted. Obviously, we see all sorts of different factors. There's things that are shining a light on Japan's traditionally very strong in competence when it comes to logistics and things like that, but in a very analog fashion. So we now see that everything from the initial,
and predictable. So when it's analog and predictable, Japan's great.
When it's analog and predictable, exactly. Japan excels, yeah. So when there's a pattern, when there's a template for how to proceed, Japan excels. But when things are disrupted because of something like a pandemic, in a crisis situation, Japan doesn't do so well. So I thought about this point, and I looked back through history. What are the points that we would have expected change to happen? There's natural disasters, there's earthquakes, there have been, the Fukushima nuclear issue, multiple points of crises. There have been other pandemics on a smaller scale. There have been warnings and scares about this sort of thing. But none of it was a change agent. Nothing actually caused Japan's digital acceleration to accelerate until now. And it's only one thing, in my opinion, that's really changing it now, and that's remote work. It's the single defining factor. When we look back on the pandemic, what will have changed? What will have accelerated the digital transformation in Japan? It's the need for remote work. So Japan did not have any culture, any provision for being able to work remotely. And just like you said in your story, when you have SMEs joining your sessions, people are still wearing a suit to join. To be fair, I'm wearing a suit today, but
you're at the office,
and I'm here in Ginza, so it's
you're in the office. This guy was in his home. He was in his apartment.
Yeah. Well, I do tend to put on, a Y shirt for most of my meetings at home in the home office, but still, there just wasn't a culture of this. So that's been the defining change. So of course, there's a lot of issues related to this. In order to remote work, you can't work completely from home, according to the government mandate, which was that they wanted businesses. I think the initiative was for 75% of businesses were supposed to be able to work from home in order to reduce the crowding in public places, the people on trains and the potential for the virus to spread. Now, you cannot do that in most Japanese corporations. You can't work from home all of the time because there was no infrastructure for that. There was a need for physical paper documents, which need to be taken into the office and physically stamped off on. So there's the Hanko issue there. Hanko, of course, being the physical seal that you have to affix to a document. And this is critical for every business process in Japan. Every decision in Japan centers around the Ringisho, which is a consensus document where every stakeholder, every head of every division, everybody involved in something like a purchasing decision or a hiring decision or even a strategic decision must physically sign off representing their section on this paper document. And then it's put on the next person's desk, and they stamp it, and you have to wait. It sits on their desk until they can come into the office and stamp it. Now you can fax that document around, and you can print it out and stamp it, but it's still a paper-based workflow in Japan. So that requirement for these fax and Hanko paper-based workflows meant that people had to actually go into the office just for the purpose of stamping documents, and then they could go back home again. But that gets a lot of media attention, but it's not the only issue. The other issue is that because Japan was a laggard in digital transformation, and because of the uncertainty avoidance requirement for most businesses, there is also a lack of awareness around correct cybersecurity protocols.
Oh gosh, yes.
And so only offices were set up with the necessary VPN and
Yes.
registered IP address, so that you could access even critical systems like your enterprise resource management program or the software that you're using for your CRM. Most workers were not able to log in to even the CRM. So even your outbound sales staff, who really should have been able to work remotely even 10 years ago, still were having to go into the office in order to log their data from the day's calls. And firsthand knowledge of this, because I worked in outside sales, and I've been out meeting clients through the day and then had to go into the office to log all of my data. And we always complained about the fact that Salesforce, for example, is actually available through a mobile app. And if we could have gotten permission to use it, we would have been able to do all of our data entry in the field. Right. And we wouldn't have had to go into the office at all. So now that's changing. Now Japanese corporations are opening up the IPNs, the necessary protocols. They're putting the security factors in place so that people can work from home. They're helping employees get set up with home internet, because a lot of them had kind of skipped over, or they'd reduced the importance of home internet and home computers because they could actually go to 4G enabled mobile phones and tablets, and that was where most of their home internet use resided. In many ways, Japan skipped over a generation of wired internet and desktop computers in the same way that Africa and Southeast Asia is right now. Right. So that's changing. The protocols are changing, and the awareness is changing. That's been a huge thing. And of course, there were accelerators as well. A huge embarrassment by the government about not being able to roll out subsidies after izakayas and restaurants and so on were affected by the lockdown. The government tried to roll out the equivalent of about a $1,000 subsidy payment to these businesses affected. But because first of all, intergovernmental agencies are vertically siloed, and then regional governments are completely vertically siloed. Not only can they not speak to each other, their computer systems are actually different physical systems. There's no LAN. They cannot communicate. The government itself could not engage in video teleconferencing, for example, because of this inconsistency in systems. So even rolling out those subsidy payments was a completely analog paper-based process, which took 3 months. And even last week's news, there are still 22 trillion yen in the government's budget for this type of subsidy and assistance to local businesses. It hasn't been deployed because there isn't the necessary infrastructure to allocate it in a responsible manner and then deploy it effectively. So we're still sitting on 22 trillion yen that really should be going out to these local businesses here. Right. That would help them a great deal. And then the initial testing was delayed. It had logistical issues, PCR-based testing. Now the vaccine registration, which is also a completely analog process, is delayed. The allocation of the actual vaccine supplies to various regions is inaccurately reported. So some regions don't know if they have enough vaccines or not. And the initiatives by businesses to try and vaccinate their employees had to be put on pause because there was not effective reporting about the stocks available. And so, unfortunately, the minister in charge of the vaccine rollout, Kono-san, had to come out and say, thank you, businesses, for trying to assist with this, but we need to put this on pause because we can't track it effectively. And then the vaccine rollout itself, as well as the tracking of people who've had the vaccine or who have come back into the country from overseas. There's a tracking app that you're supposed to use. It was revealed that there was a fault in that app, and I forget how many. It was thousands of people had not been tracked properly because they were on Android and the app hadn't been updated correctly for
Oh
anything other than
no.
iOS. So all of these embarrassments have come together, and they're adding to this awareness of Japan's digital, laggardism.
Mm-hmm.
And it was interesting. There's a great interview you can read in English on Rakuten's website, where the CEO of Rakuten, Mikitani-san, sat down with the new minister who will be in charge of the digital agency, which I'd like to talk about more in a minute. But Minister Hirai sat down with Mikitani and talked about, this is the first time the Japanese populace is realizing that Japan is a digital laggard.
Right.
Until now, all of these different processes that have required so much going from one department to another and filling out multiple forms and so on, they were numb to it. They didn't realize that it was an issue. But now they're seeing how other countries who probably started even later than Japan have rolled out their vaccines with less issues. So it's an embarrassment for Japan.
Yeah. And I think also touching on your point of remote work, and I think that's absolutely true, it being really one of the key differences. I think it's also to do with the fact that there are so many multinational service-based companies also running and operating in Japan, whether it's a consultancy or whether it's whatever it may be, but a service-based company that's operated, that has a Japan office, and let's say their mothership has said, we're just pausing all face-to-face work, or all, our offices are closed, you can't come in, don't even try, the doors are locked. And I think it's been also a real push from these companies as well. I've have quite a few contacts in Japan in the consulting industry, and anyone who I have seen at a client site, and I said, what are you? Is that a Zoom background, or are you in an actual office? And like, no, I'm in an actual office. And the reason is because a domestic firm doesn't have the capability to operate purely remotely. So I've seen that the remote work, I wouldn't say is led by, but I would certainly say is strongly ambassadored by foreign firms who have taken a very clear non-negotiable stance on remote work. It's, you're not coming back and that's it. Whereas other companies, and I think this is also to do like with the politics in Japan as well, is they can never enforce something outrightly, absolutely. It's purely a recommendation. So the companies take it as such. They take it as a recommendation, whereas the multinationals have made absolute rulings in terms of no, offices, stay at home.
Yeah, it's probably a reflection of Japan's consensus-based decision-making process that without all stakeholders on board, these initiatives can't be put in place. So it's sort of gray areas and half measures and sort of infighting whatnot that leads to gridlock. But it is, it's very interesting. You mentioned the service sector, and I want to talk about that in a bit more detail in just a moment. But it is interesting to see how internationalization is one of these levers that's leading to more digital transformation. And let's just pull on that thread a little bit, because it's the more international services companies that are located here in Tokyo are showing how remote work can work for their Japanese employees. So that's a
right.
change agent. There's also a change agent in the fact of, more foreigners have been working within Japanese corporations. There's been an opening up for the new ESG initiatives for more participation on corporate boards by foreigners and women, more diversity, and a breaking out of the traditional mindset that a lot of boards have had. So there's certainly this gaiatsu, or external foreign pressure, which traditionally is one of the largest change agents for Japan. I mean, basically, Japan, it takes a long time to change. When it changes because there's enough internal pressure that builds up to a tipping point, or there's external pressure. The black ship gunboat diplomacy is one. Commodore Perry and the black ships is one element of that, but foreign trade organizations and so on applying pressure is another. But there are other accelerators. I mean, even if it hadn't been for the pandemic, I think we were pretty close to reaching a tipping point where Japan would have started to embrace more digital transformation anyway because of the socioeconomic factors. So the reality is Japan has an aging population, the world's fastest, first developed nation to really face this issue. Because of this aging population, Japan is going through a huge generational change. The up and coming millennial generation of workers, they want to work in a much more work-life balanced manner. They want to have their own free time. They don't want to spend time, after working on the weekends with their coworkers like previous generations did. So this is causing a generational change. The simple economic factors of a potentially looming decline in GDP, like we talked about earlier, after 2025, Japan could lose 109 billion US dollars annually if it doesn't engage in digital transformation. Womenomics is another change factor. So, the Abe government had identified this as one of the pillars of their economic revitalization, was more female participation in the workforce, which is not realistic in a traditional Japanese office environment where your physical participation is the defining metric by which middle management determines your contribution to the organization, also your eligibility for promotion. I mean, if you have children or elderly parents, and traditionally women are the caregivers who are responsible for this, it's not possible to be physically in the office from 8 a.m. until 9 p.m. and then go to the nomikai after work session where the actual interpersonal communication happens. People used to, in a traditional Japanese office, people used to spend like 16 hours of their day with their coworkers.
Yeah.
And it's not realistic at several times in a person's life, especially for women, if they're having children. It's just not possible. And that's why in their 30s or mid 30s, many women would drop out of the workforce to have children. They would re-enter the workforce after they had children, but on a part-time basis. And even the drive in female participation in recent years that has come about because of Abenomics was not actually women working in the previous jobs that they'd had back on the same career path. They were rejoining the workforce, but it was in part-time work, and it was mostly work in the services sector. And those are unfortunately the least productive and least well-paying jobs in Japan. And they tend to be the ones that actually have long hours and overwork, but they're not well tracked because of some of the loopholes in the employment structures. So all of these are change agents. But another one that's actually a positive change agent from government, an example of them leading, is the creation of the new digital agency. So a lot of people don't know what Prime Minister Suga's original primary campaign leading flagpole initiative was, but it was the creation of the digital agency. He was my guy, and I'm sad that he got sidetracked and hasn't proven to be a very effective leader because of the pandemic and through the Olympic debacle that's happened. But he was my guy because he's an entrepreneur. He worked his way up from not a preeminent family like many of the other politicians in Japan. He was an entrepreneur. He's a business guy. He understands what's necessary, and he was the first one to really get through the gridlock, the internal agency infighting, and create standardization for digital transformation. That is the legislation that was passed a couple of months ago and takes effect in September. It is the creation of an actual digital agency to solve some of these problems. And what it's going to do is solve a lot of those uncertainty avoidance problems by shining a light and leading the way in terms of standardization. So Trust services is a good way to think about what they're doing. It's things like interagency standardization, getting all of the different governmental agencies on the same computer systems, making sure that they would be capable of actually having an interdepartmental Zoom call, for example, or teleconference. Getting rid of some of the vertically structured bureaucracy issues so that at least they can send each other emails and basic infrastructure is in place. And this is things like security, cyber security, and then that's the starting point is intergovernmental standardization, and then regional governmental standardization, computer systems where regional governments, the local city office can communicate with the national government for subsidy payouts and this sort of thing. And then the next step will be cooperation with other governments internationally. So standardization of document processing protocols with the EU and the US. And then finally, an interface between the government and the populace. So that interface is actually going to be the digitization of the My Number card, like a social insurance number that has currently only achieved something like 24% adoption in its analog form. The government has been pushing for 10 years to try to get people to sign up for this, but there hasn't been much incentive to do so. That will now be tied to your personal bank account so that you would be able to receive subsidies or like tax returns and all sorts of different interactions with the government. That'll be streamlined. And it's a great initiative. It's projected that this, if these problems aren't solved, it would cost 323 million working hours per year in governmental processes. And that's a personnel cost of over $8 billion.
Right, and anyone been to the Xiaoshou can very quickly see where the 323 million hours come from.
That's how long it took me to process my my address, my last address change, and then everything I needed to do to apply for the mortgage to build this house. Yeah, about 323 billion hours.
So 323 million, is simply just Evan's personal cost. That's what he's talking here. But exactly. if we think about that as well, I could what they do, I think, is so important. The fact that they've got somewhat of a clearer mission than other agencies tend to have. Often you'll get a government agency and then no one kind of really knows what they're doing, and then it will kind of die out with the Prime Minister. But I think what's also important here is that we've spoken about digital transformation, I would say more as a mindset, as a culture, whereas this is now that we kind of have this agency, it puts a face and it also puts a responsibility or accountability to certain individuals. And as we know in Japan, that when a task is connected to a person or a group, then it's usually taken really quite seriously. Whereas if we kind of say someone should maybe do this, then, it just kind of goes often in the too hard basket. But when we now have this agency and their faces and people see them and they know these are the people that we can talk to, and often any kind of change in Japan is really so dependent on support and communication and doing things kind of together. And so having that kind of commonality that people can come to and say, okay, you're the people we can talk to. I can see that before even what they do, the fact that they even exist formally, I can see that in itself is also a great step forward, because and I think we've dug a lot, and anyone who I'll certainly say this at the beginning of the episode, also in our introduction, but if you haven't listened to already, certainly go ahead and listen to Evan's first episode, because it gives you such a great understanding, not simply just of business processes, but also of how people think, which is also why I didn't spend a whole lot of time sharing with you who Evan is, because I can list the thousands of things he does, but listening to him is how you will understand who Evan is. And this is kind of when I thought, you and I are both passionate about Japan, in the sense of we recognize the pain points, not to complain, but rather to act. And I think this is the thing that I feel, one of the things I feel I most connect with you on is that it's easy to throw stones and people say, yeah, well, Japan this, and they don't have this, and how ridiculous. And yes, well, we all know that. But if you're just going to sit in the corner and complain, you can join the other team because we don't have time. Don't you understand? We don't have the time to just complain. And so this is why I was so interested to see that if we look to that roadmap of 2025, that you actually have quite a few ideas of, okay, if we were also on that to join the next meeting, what would be some of the things that you would bring up with them in terms of, okay, if we're moving from now to 2025, what's on the top of our list in terms of issues?
Great setup, thank you. So here's my roadmap for 2025. First of all, I think focus is really important. And I get concerned sometimes that Japan, even METI, is focusing on the wrong areas. Because the stats show that we actually need to focus not so much on Japan, where Japan currently excels, which is in monozukuri, manufacturing, and the stage where it currently competes best globally on exporting things. The actual greatest potential for change is in the services sector.
Great point.
So if the services sector in Japan has a great deal of overlap with small and medium-sized enterprises. In fact, that represents 70% of the workforce, but it only represents 49% of contribution to GDP. So what we can do is focus on this issue, because increasing productivity at large corporations, it isn't going to move the needle that much. IoT, 5G, edge computing, all of these things that are part of like the Society 5.0 initiative, for example, they're incremental improvements to what is already the world's most automated and in many ways most efficient manufacturing sector. So let's look at the greatest room for improvement. And that's where Japan is lagging behind right now the most, is in small and medium-sized enterprises, especially in the services sector, because they haven't been investing in IT. So, CapEx spending in Japanese services sector has flatlined since the year 2000. Basically, the service sector completely ignored the IT revolution. In contrast, Japanese manufacturers increased capital investment spending steadily from about 20 million to over 26 million between the year 2000 and 2017. And currently, the industrial workers, the blue-collar workers in Japan, are working with the best machinery available: robotics, leading edge, edge computing. They're doing great. The white-collar workers are working with last-generation technology. So we need to basically to reform and digitalize the traditional office environment. I call this the digitalization of the salaryman. And this is because many of these companies are not competitive for a few different reasons. One is tax incentives, government-backed small business loans that probably keep them in business beyond where they should have gone out of business. They're non-competitive because they don't compete on the global stage, so they don't have foreign competition. They only have domestic competition. They're often staffed by the median age for CEOs in this sector is 74 years old. And so they're staffed by very senior management teams, and it's just hard. They're often termed zombie companies for this reason. So I like to focus on where we can make the most change. I'm working on what I call the rule of 70, which is a series of coincidental 70% factors. So 70% of Japan's workforce works in the services sector. 70% of those white collar tasks can actually be replaced by AI and automation because they're very repetitive. And 70% of Japan's engineers currently work in systems integrators, not in-house or on-site. So that's that 70-70-70. Service sector, repetitive tasks for white-collar workers, systems integrators. Let's focus on those issues. So we want to help service sector companies to be more productive. We can do that by helping to remove a lot of the paperwork and the repetitive tasks that they're doing with the application of AI. And we can implement that AI by working with the systems integrators like Fujitsu, NTT Data, and NEC, because they employ 70% of Japanese engineers. Maybe a little known fact, but most enterprises in Japan, regardless of their size, don't actually have in-house on-site IT resources. there's been a culture of outsourcing. And so it's actually the systems integrators who are maintaining these old legacy systems, and they're the ones who need to reform. So this is specifically a call. If you work at a systems integrator, please invest in getting off those legacy systems and the adoption of cloud services and so on. So we can also, solve some of these issues by having more IT workers in-house. We need to get off these legacy systems like those old COBOL systems, in the case that they are inefficient, basically boxed software, in-house customized software applications that are no longer going to be supported. And this is a wide range, everything from legacy SAP systems to most computers in both private and public sector in Japan currently running on Windows 7, which is no longer going to be supported. So there's a looming date where everything needs to be changed. It needs to move into the cloud and SaaS models, software as a subscription model, where everything is constantly updated and you always have the latest version. This will remove a lot of these issues. And the impact of AI cannot be underestimated. So we need traditional AI engineers who can help to build out customized solutions or specific solutions, implementation of specific solutions for enterprises and government. But also there's a huge, wide suite of software that's available with a very low barrier to entry. For example, my current company, which I represent, I'm the country manager of Dynamic Yield, which is an AI-enabled platform that improves the user experience online. It applies machine learning and A/B testing, best-in-class protocols to understand user intent and serve them with the correct experience and the correct products when they're shopping online. I advise Botify, which is an AI-enabled SEO improvement software, remove some of the burden on in-house SEOs to improve the overall website. Some interesting companies have been making waves on the Tokyo Mothers market recently, like AI Inside, that applies AI to optical character recognition of handwritten documents. SPI, that's another company that's currently sort of the darling of the investment world. It's doing quite well. And then any company that processes large amounts of data and garners insight from that to engage in strategic decision making. All of these sort of technologies are going to help, whether it's internal insights or external insights of what your competitors are doing, getting good structured data upon which to make clear decisions. This is going to help improve these overall, both decision-making processes and internal work processes. There has to be more retraining. So it's interesting that Japan currently does not engage in training its workforce, even to the level of the other OECD nations. Currently, the percentage of Japanese workers who are undergoing training or retraining is only about 35%, as opposed to the OECD average of 40%. And leading nations, countries who are doing especially well at digital transformation, some of the Scandinavian nations, for example, and the US, they tend to train workers much higher at about a 50% average. So 50% of your workforce is currently undergoing some form of company-sponsored training in leading nations. In Japan, it's only 35. So the promise of digital transformation, work style reform, remote work, the ability to get more time for yourself because you're not commuting all the time. Part of this promise is also the ability for the company now to invest in you to retrain, to take advantage of these new technologies and to be a part of this digital transformation revolution. There are some examples of this that are interesting. Daikin, for example, is a company that's a very wide range of services. I think they're probably famous for their cleaning services, most of all. They're in both the services and manufacturing sector. So they announced recently that they're going to do in-house training, and they will make 1,000 employees AI savvy by the year 2022. So they're currently undergoing that retraining of employees. It was actually the Abe government created this initiative that 250,000 AI engineers should be trained per year. So that's sort of a top-down initiative that retraining is essential. And it's also important to note that we can't just look to the young generation, the up and coming like millennials who are digital natives, who are familiar with all this technology. We have to look to current workers,
Mm.
many of whom are now in their 50s,
Mm-hmm.
60s, and even 70s. 30% of the population aged 70 to 74 is still engaged in the workforce.
Mm-hmm.
So people are working longer past the retirement age of 75. In fact, the
Mm.
government is probably going to raise the retirement age from 65 to 70. So these are the people who actually need to be retrained. We need to focus on the adoption of
Mm-hmm.
technology, making it easy enough to use that seniors who didn't grow up with this technology can use it relatively easily.
I think that's a really great point, especially because we often look to, if we think about digital workers, we often think young, whereas that's a real lost opportunity if we think about just how much knowledge and experience that different generations have, whether it's the 50 plus generation or the 60 plus or even 65 plus generation in Japan. Of course, things are different. The playing field is different. However, Japan has been a very strong economy for many, many years. 52% of companies over 100 years old are Japanese companies, which means this
Yes.
is not necessarily something new to weather the winds of the harsh winds. This is something that Japanese companies know about, and I think to kind of ignore the older workers is really an overlooked opportunity, because as we know, even with old data and technology, it's only as good as the input. And if you have only young workers, well, they can operate, but do they have context to the business, to the industry? What can they bring? And this is where we kind of see these that multi-generational teams and companies can really be so successful. But certainly, as you mentioned, we have to find a way in which that there's a common playing field, because the experience of that these older workers have are essential in order to stay relevant in the future. So yeah, absolutely with you on that one, that we need to find a way that we can get everybody on the same playing
And
field.
and it's often said in Japan that there's sort of a generational war, and that we need the current generation to just retire and get out of the way, so that the up and coming workers,
Mm-hmm.
millennials, and closer to my generation. I was born in the 70s, but yeah, this up and coming generation can take over and initiate reform. Um, and I used to think that too. Okay, maybe the oyaji, the colloquial term for these old guys, and most Japanese companies are managed by an average CEO age of 60, and their entire senior management cohort, they're in their 60s now. It was my thinking that maybe they should just get out of the way, but
Mm-hmm.
uh, that's wrong. I believe it's wrong. I
Mm.
believe it would be a complete underutilization of an incredibly valuable resource if you didn't engage in retraining senior workers and allow those who want to work. 40% of people in their 70s in Japan want to work,
Mm-hmm.
way higher than the OECD average. Uh, so people, and they're very genki. Like, a lot of the guys I serve with in the Shonan area are in their 70s, and they're way better than me. So these people have energy, and
Yeah.
they have a lot that they can contribute to the workforce. They have a great deal of knowledge. Of course, they need to undertake a mind shift change. They need
Right.
to be accustomed to new working styles. The old heroes of Japan, the office environment, the salaryman who used to be a cultural hero, has now become society's enemy, in some ways its
Mm.
greatest enemy. So this requires a massive shift in thinking. And it's, in many ways, it's a blow to one's pride if they spent their entire career building a system and they're now just ready for retirement and ready to enjoy it. And all of a sudden the system has to change on them.
Mm.
But that's the nature of what we're undergoing right now. It is the information revolution. We are seeing a massive societal change. And this final accelerator of the pandemic is the final acceleration point of this it's here to stay now. And so we need to invest in retraining these workers in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, maybe even beyond, to become comfortable with digital technology. Now, that doesn't mean they need to be engineers. They don't need to be coding, but they need to
Absolutely.
become
Yeah,
comfortable
exactly.
with the smartphone-based or the mouse-based drag and drop interfaces that allow them to interact with digital systems, the ability to become more comfortable with the front-end human-machine interfaces that power cloud software.
And
And they need to just,
the test case, for example, is for can Oyaji use these kinds of platforms, yes or no? Is Facebook. The fact that we've had
yeah,
some really older senior people say, I don't check my email so much because it's, there's too much going on. So if you need to contact me here, that they send, private confidential documents via Facebook Messenger and things like that. This is obviously like a whole nother conversation of cybersecurity. But in terms of can they operate drag and drop, the answer is yes, because the older Japanese people are very active on Facebook.
and yes, I agree. I think that instant messaging, Facebook and Line have been the
Line,
adoption
of
point.
course, the winner there.
Yeah. So a lot of people are just messaging online now. I think that's been the entry point for the general populace. I think actually the largest change agent has been e-commerce. So during the pandemic, people moved to shopping online and selling online. And there's a large part of the senior population who has moved their previous retail store presence online. In fact, they drive a large percentage of Rakuten shops, as well as Base, which is sort of Japan's version of Shopify, and Shopify itself. And what's the other one? Krima, which is like the Japanese version of Etsy, if I remember correctly. It's targeted to craftspeople. So a lot of these people are creating retail environments and actually selling products or selling services online now. And a lot of it is a predominantly smartphone-based interface, which is relatively user-friendly. And then we're moving into voice interfaces, so you don't
Right.
have to stare at a tiny text on a small screen, and things that are continually lowering the barrier to entry for this technology, as well as AI assistants. So case in point, I am working on a book right now, which I'm basically writing through the use of AI assistants. Every time I do a talk like the one we're having right now, I use AI to transcribe the transcript, and I'm training it to understand the terminology I'm using and the language and the tone of voice. And then I'm using another AI to do sentiment analysis and understand where certain topics match, and then compile all of that into a massive manuscript, which I will then trim
Oh,
down
wow.
into a book. It's over 100,000 words long at this point, so it needs to be trimmed down a fair amount. But I'm able to do that, and hopefully I'll be able to put out a book relatively quickly because of these AI assistants. And I'm doing that mostly just to practice what I preach, and personally
Of
try to
course.
learn about using AI, even though I have no formal training in this. I can code basic HTML and JavaScript and that sort of thing, but I'm not an engineer. So I'm trying to be an advocate for adoption of AI because I believe it is so essential. So let's maybe just close up with some of my predictions for how things are going to go as we move towards 2025. Here are the things that I think are really going to take hold and make a change. So number one is these AI augmented business processes, document processing, removing the bottlenecks around just repetitive work tasks, filling out forms and scanning those into databases, and then correctly labeling all of that data so that it can be used in the cloud by AI in order to gain insights, the application of AI for decision making. And this is, by the way, something which I'm a very, very strong advocate of. I believe that AI augmented decision making, not replacing the human with a machine, but augmenting the human with a machine, I think is absolutely critical for several reasons, some of them being cultural. And one of them is that in a consensus-based decision-making culture, you can remove the uncertainty around making decisions and the need to have complete stakeholder alignment by improving the decision-making process. So
Mhm.
how do you make a decision? Basically, you gather all of the information that you know through your personal experience, all of the data that you have at hand, you discuss it until you have a consensus, you stamp off on that or sign off on that, and a decision is made. Well, a lot of that relies on personal experience, which is also subject to personal bias.
Mhm.
You can improve that decision-making process by engaging in data-driven decision-making. So if you have properly structured, solid, reliable data, and you have AI that can gain insights from that, you can augment your decision-making process and remove a lot of the burden for decision-making, make it much more efficient, remove the bottlenecks by this AI augmented process. Now, in a culture that suffers from this almost paralysis that comes from uncertainty avoidance, and Japan, of course, has this for real reasons. There are constant disruptions and earthquakes and typhoons and wars and all sorts of things that have traditionally disrupted society. So people want to understand everything that's implied in making a decision. So they remove some of that uncertainty. But in a culture that has a high level of uncertainty avoidance, you have things like depression, mental
Mhm.
health issues. Alcoholism is
Mm.
common to almost all cultures that have a high level of uncertainty avoidance, as well as suicide rate. And suicide is actually the leading cause of death in young people in Japan, much
Mhm.
higher than most other developed nations. So uh, by being able to, in my opinion, being able to apply some of this technology to remove some of the burden of decision-making process, we can benefit society at large, both in business and even in interpersonal decision-making processes. So I think that's absolutely essential. We need better work-life balance. That's going to come from the ability to remote work and have flexible work, and no longer have middle management be looking at in-office participation as the primary metric for company loyalty, and start to engage in an understanding of actual KPIs by which you should be managing your workforce. I think over the next few years, we'll see a huge mindset shift. We'll see retraining, not just of technology, but also of work processes. Uh, get middle management to understand that it's essential for people to be able to work in a diverse workplace with differing viewpoints, um, and in environments that will encourage participation of the female workers and seniors and foreigners and all sorts of people who can contribute very strongly to the business environment and to their business model. So there needs to be a shift away from the old traditional office environment and the salaryman. I think we'll see the end of the traditional office. Uh, I think we'll see a lot more co-working spaces like I'm in right now, shared work spaces, and maybe we'll see an average, I think, of about 3 days a week in the office and the rest working from home or working from remote locations. I think the government's Society 5.0 initiative, which is connected devices, smart cities, mobility as a service. For example, Toyota is moving their business model from personal car ownership to cars as a service. And this encompasses flying cars, which we're only a few years away from adopting, as well as delivery drones and various components of the mobility infrastructure, which are made possible because of the convergence of edge computing and AI algorithms that allow the flying car to not crash. Autonomous cars, of course, self-driving cars. And things like blockchain is going to make a huge difference when it comes to managing the document process. Digital ledgers will revitalize real estate, for example. Imagine if we could solve this Akia problem, all these empty homes that nobody can buy because nobody knows who actually has the deed to the house and then who has
Mm.
the deed to the land, and it's all confused. So that's going to make a huge change, I think, in the next few years. Continued retail transformation, cashless payments. We're already at the point I can go through most of my day without ever having to use cash now. I just charge via Apple Pay to my Suica card, which is here in my phone. I
Mhm.
scan this to get on the train and go to the convenience store and to pay for lunch. Uh, Saves me probably 15, 20 minutes a day doing that.
Mhm.
I think we'll see GovCoin, an actual currency. I think the Japanese government can save a huge amount in issuing currency if there's the adoption of an official gov coin. And we'll see more shift to e-commerce. I think in the future, even here in the Ginza area, if you go to a retail shop, they won't actually have clothing in stock. Clothing will be in fulfillment centers. We'll see more distribution centers built out around the country, and they'll be completely autonomous, staffed by robots. You'll go into a shop for a consultation. There will be staff or possibly AI augmented systems there, so they understand your size and you can get completely scanned, and they'll recommend the clothing that fits correctly, and then they won't have the stock there on site, but they'll ship it either to your home or to your office so that it'll be ready for you when you get there. And I guess in that occasional outlying situation when you are on your way to a party and you've spilled red wine on your party dress or something and need a new dress in a second, maybe there will be some infrastructure to accommodate for that as well. So it'll be delivered to your of your Chanel gown or whatever it is. But I think we actually will see a huge shift towards that sort of infrastructure. I think we're going to see massive energy transformation. We're only a year or two away from solar actually being cheaper than coal and nuclear power. We're going to see massive improvements in the efficiency of solar power. And for areas where solar is not sufficient, Japan's excellent hydrogen infrastructure, which is being pioneered by Toyota, will be built out so that we'll have hydrogen power centers for the more remote locations far away from solar farms. And blockchain, of course, is going to revitalize or revolutionize, really, the energy market as well. It'll be much easier to purchase energy. Energy is a commodity which is traded, right? So blockchain will make it much easier to purchase this on a much more efficient scale, and it'll bring down the overall price of renewable energy as well. I think Japan has the ability to be a leader in this field, and there's an appetite for it. And finally, Japan, with its aging population, it's the first country in the world that has the ability to apply AI and automation to improve productivity, improve people's lives, and improve the overall GDP without job loss. It's not going to take people's jobs away. It's going to create more jobs. So anybody who wants to future-proof their career for the next 10 to 15 years probably should come and work in Japan, become an expert in AI and automation and digital transformation, and then learn how to apply this to the next societies who are going to have an aging population. North America, and Scandinavian countries, South Korea, etc. So those are my predictions. That's where I think we are. I think that's basically the 2025 roadmap that we're on here. But we skipped over one thing that I think is actually essential to all of this, and this is your area of expertise. If we're going to engage in digital transformation, we must have a change in thinking senior management. It's the people that have held up digital transformation. It's not the technology. Japan has the infrastructure, 5G, underlying broadband internet. It's all here. What's holding it up is the mindset. So one thing that can be a huge change agent is design thinking. Would you like to share your thoughts on how design thinking can help alleviate some of these problems?
Yeah. Design thinking, absolutely. When I first learned about design thinking, when I was studying at the D School in Berlin, I was shocked at the parallels that design thinking has with traditional Japanese organizations. I'm not talking about Japanese organizations of today. I'm talking about the Panasonic, Matsushita in its early days, that kind of mentality. It's the idea that if we first understand the problem before the solution, then that's probably a good thing. And when we do think of the solutions, if we think about society, design thinking, we talk about the user. We talk a lot about user empathy. User empathy, while it's a very foreign concept in Japan, or it's a very foreign terminology in Japan, the idea of how does this person feel この人はどう思ってるのか、どう感じてるのか。You hear this is daily conversation in Japan. What do others people think? What is that around you? So I think in terms of empathy, which is really the key of design thinking, I think Japan is actually quite a mature society. They don't call it empathy, but the practice of empathy is certainly there. The second thing that design thinking relies on is multidisciplinary teams. And this is something that we saw, you know, for centuries in Japanese companies, that you would join as a lawyer and you would spend 3 months in sales and 3 months in HR and 3 months on the gemba, just so you kind of knew what was going on, because there was this importance of what other people do. Understanding what other people do is important. So having multidisciplinary teams, and I think perhaps another added layer to that, what we see now, would be not only multidisciplinary, i.e., someone in sales, someone in AI developing a solution together. I also think that another element of diversity we can add is not just diversity in job title, but also maybe in position. How a younger person views this issue might be different to how an older person views this issue. Why is that? And digging deeper there. For me, the reason why I kind of felt design thinking is at home in Japan in a way is because it's not only a mindset, it's a methodology. And Japanese people love a process. If you tell me I have to do this and then take these steps and I'd have to do this for 30 minutes, and if you can give me like a recipe, if you can act like as my GPS in a workshop, they feel really great, because it comes back to that, you know, uncertainty avoidance. Essentially, what we're doing is equipping the Japanese working population at large, not only with the mindset for innovation and change, but also with the tools. But I'm not driving the car. It's the same thing as having a GPS on your phone or in your car. You have it on your phone. Google isn't there monitoring me where I'm going. It just gives me a map. And I think that that the Japanese working population has such a great foundation in terms of empathy for others and multidisciplinary teams. We could work a little bit on openness, but that usually just comes in terms of where we are in the design thinking double diamond. You know, let's make sure that we solve the problem first. But all of these elements kind of sum up for me as a way that design thinking is actually quite close to not the current Japanese company structure, but the company structure from 100 years ago. And what did we see from Japanese companies 100 years ago? Incredible success, blowing the globe away with the innovations and just how they were doing things. And I recently was talking to someone who said the problem with Japan now is we have this weird mix. Rather than having the best of both worlds, i.e. the best of global best practice and the best of Japan, we took the worst. We took the individualism of abroad, and then we added bureaucracy. We could have taken the individualism and then added collaboration. What would Japan look like then? So his kind of point was, if we could shift to not kind of like Japan 1980, but if we went to Japan 1890, those companies are more equipped to survive today than any company around. And I thought that was really interesting.
I think that's a great point, because I would sum this issue up by saying that vertical silos are Japan's greatest problem right now. The government tends to be vertically siloed to the point where even bureaus within the same agency, they don't speak to each other, cannot speak to each other. And companies tend to be so vertically siloed that they cannot easily collaborate with each other. Society in general tends to be very group dynamic oriented. The greater society, there's awareness of what's beneficial to the greater society, but the group comes first. And we see a lot of the corporate governance issues. Just topically, Toshiba and Mitsubishi Electric are in the news right now for violations of corporate governance. And it's because the group was so beholden to their department first and foremost, beyond anything else, that they had such a narrow focus. They felt that it was justified to falsify safety data, for example, or make decisions that went against not just best practices, but sometimes even the law, in favor of their group dynamic. So this insular, vertically integrated culture is one thing that needs to change. There actually needs to be more group collaboration, but on a wider scale.
Yeah, Evan, I couldn't agree more. If we were to look ahead, so we were talking, of course, the roadmap 2025, but you've given us so much insight, so much data. And the thing that I most enjoy when talking to you, that we have this mix of not only technology insights, business insight, but it's also through such an empathetic mind. And you always have, it's so nice to see someone who's speaking about business and speaking about technology, but really at the core of it is always people. So it's always such a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for sharing. And I think we'll have to draw the line here. Otherwise, we'll just keep on going. So, Evan, thank you so much again. It's always such a pleasure to have you. Come back anytime.
Thank you so much, Brittany. It's been an honor, and I look forward to our next talk.